Hi, everyone. This chapter, we are going to talk about women in the legal profession, um, and how the representation there, um, goes forward. Okay, so first, we'll go over just a little bit of the history. Um, and your book goes through this. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I think a lot of times we think that women either have always been involved in the law or it didn't happen until like 1960. And neither one of those things are really the case. Our first official practicing lawyer was Margaret Brent, and she was doing this in 1647. Now, she was an anomaly, right? This wasn't like a common practice during that time, but she did exist. Now, and there were others after her and then in between, but that was kind of before we had really formalized the profession of attorney, right? That was before law schools really existed in mass and bar exams and things like that. So once those structures got into place, it was a little bit harder because there was a lot of exclusions. So then the first woman, to be admitted to a state bar didn't happen until 1869. So while we recognize Margaret Brent as the first practicing lawyer, there wasn't like, I mean, you could just kind of hang out a shingle and be like, lawyer, right here. Um, but once that process was formalized, there were a lot of barriers, right? And so we know that the first person to kind of go through those barriers was Mansfield, and that was 200 and some years later. All right, I'm going to put all this up here. So, even with that, having women kind of going through the bar and being admitted to the state bar, there was still a lot of discrimination, right? So, just because things are legal doesn't mean that they're widely accepted, doesn't mean that there's not discrimination happening to discourage people from doing said thing. And you can apply that statement to pretty much anything, right? So there was still a lot of discrimination. And I put a couple quotes from actual case law up here for you to kind of illustrate this. And these were women wanting to become lawyers or lawyers, depending on the situation, suing the state for access to law school for acceptance into the bar. And these are just some of the rulings that came back. So again, this is 1873. So a couple years after the first woman was admitted to the state bar. And this was a state case in which the finding was, no, we're going to pass because the natural and proper timidity and delicacy for which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. What? Right. So these are rulings that are coming out of the court. And again, going back to why things are legal, right? There's still a lot of discrimination coming back. And when it's coming from the institution in which you are trying to engage, right, it's not going to make it a popular choice for women. So, well, these lawsuits were happening. It wasn't like women were beating down doors to get into the legal profession because they clearly weren't wanted. Around the same time frame, this was a Supreme Court justice saying, oh, actually, the importance of maintaining the respective spheres of man and woman, with women performing the duties of motherhood and wife in accordance with the law of the Creator. And that again is coming out of the Supreme Court. There's all kinds of issues with separation of church and state in that statement, right? But these were the messages that women were receiving from the place in which they're trying to get into. And this is one of the reasons why the legal profession was for a long time was thought of as, men's work, men's work, men's work, even though it's like white collar men's work. Sometimes we think about men's work as like, police, right? If we're thinking criminal justice, correction officers, construction, a lot of the trade type things like manual, hands, harder, right? I'm just talking about with tougher material type things. Labor is thought of as man's work, but lawyers kind of fell into that as well. So today, roughly. And these statistics are a little, depending on who's collecting them, but they're about the same. They're within some kind of margin of error. You do see almost equal representation for a lot of things, and we'll kind of pick through why some of these things might look a little bit different. But almost half of law school students are female. More than half of general college students in the country right now are female. Just fun fact. 51% of law clerks, 54% of law school faculty. So there we're above half, and we'll talk about why that might be. But you notice kind of a drop here, right? So law school students, 47%, practicing lawyers, 36% of females become practicing lawyers. And the term practicing can mean a variety of different things. You can be a lawyer and not maybe practice law specifically, but you might work in a legal capacity for a company. There's all kinds of ways you can define that, and that's why that number might be a little bit different. Also, there is, kind of an exit pattern for females out of law. And then you look at about 21% of law firm partnerships are female. Now, we'll talk about why some of those numbers might look the way they do. Well, we'll talk about it now. So law is interesting in criminal justice in that, if you remember from the last segment, these percentages of female involvement are way higher than policing, way higher than corrections. They're almost exponentially higher. There's a couple reasons for that. We talked about some of the barriers for law enforcement and corrections, one being like shift work, right? So I will tell you from personal experience, my husband's on afternoon turn right now, and it's awful in terms of like childcare, right? It just does not work well for people with kids. And by default, a lot of times that responsibility is still falling to women, even in 2023, right? So that may be some of it. Whereas lawyers have a little bit more flexibility in setting their own hours. I mean, you got to work within the hours of the court, you got to work within the hours of business, that type of thing. Faculty, kind of the same thing. Now, if you break this down, though, into criminal law, you do not see a lot of females entering criminal law. One of the reasons for that may be you are a little bit more on call. You have a little bit less control over your schedule than, say, if you are legal counsel for a university, a company. You can kind of set your own pace and set your own schedule. If you're a criminal attorney, you might have to, you might get called at 2 a.m. to go do something. Your time is dictated now by the court. You don't really have a ton of insight into, or, sway. Sorry, I lost my words into when your things are scheduled. So you lose a little bit of that control. And then you see this dip down even a little bit more in terms of law firm partnerships, right? Because one of the things that we know about law firms is that you have to earn those partnerships typically by hours billed. And if you are, even if you have the best support system in the world in terms of a partner, family, that type of thing, it's just very, very demanding. And sometimes women are less likely to choose that sacrifice than men. Not that there's anything wrong with either one. Women are just less likely to do it, which makes them less likely to advance. So in law, I already mentioned, criminal law, you don't see that same, about 50-50 split. Females are overrepresented in a lot of different areas, mainly the three I listed here. Juvenile delinquency, family law, and victims' rights. These tend to be where females track even in law schools in terms of specializations when they come out of law school. These are kind of the big three that females tend to go into at a higher rate than males. Males go into these, females go into criminal law, corporate law, that type of thing. But here's where you see the bulk of them. And, it's kind of the same for even academics, right? So we'll go to the there's like two big criminal justice organizations, national organizations, and I'll typically go to like one of their conferences a year. And in those conferences, it's so funny to just kind of sit back and take a look at the big scope of things. So here you have all of these like academics or practitioners, lawyers, judges, researchers, professors, the whole deal. Anybody criminal justice-y, right, is going to be at one of these two conferences, basically. And it is very skewed towards men, unless you are going to sessions and discussing topics that involve, like I always go to the ones about like sexual violence, feminist criminology, and even teaching. And that's where you find all the women. They're in those three. And like, sometimes I'll try to step out of my little bubble and I'll go to something like, aging and corrections or something like that. And I might be the only woman in the whole room, right? So it's very, very true in lots of different professions. But specifically in criminal justice, females are kind of track themselves either way into these specialties. Like I said, the schedule is going to preclude some areas, mostly criminal and like very high demand corporate law. Excuse me. So if you are working in that field, in criminal law or corporate law or something like that, you might be channeled more into like an in-house position. So I'm going to be the lawyer that covers A through Z here, but it's going to keep me on a steady schedule. It's going to keep me with a little bit of freedom. I'm not going to be working 90 hours a week. I'm not going to be on call all the time. Or I might be support staff to like an overseeing lawyer type thing. So you have that as well. Now, when it comes to judges, right? It's so interesting, right? So the higher you go in terms of judges, the higher the percentage of females gets. So it's kind of the opposite when we talked about like chiefs of police, wardens of prisons, things like that. Lower percentage of women, the higher you go. Here, the pyramid's like a little bit upside down, whereas the straight pyramid there. So roughly, about 22% of federal judges are female and about 26% of state court judges are female. And again, these numbers change, right? But it's not going to jump from 22 to 80. So it's about correct. Fun fact, when you go through, we're not going to go through how courts work in this class, but everybody should know our highest court, right? Our Supreme Court, we have 9 justices, and we have quite a few that are female, right? So we have these two I put up here. These two are no longer serving. They're both deceased. We have Sandra Day O'Connor here and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first serving female Supreme Court justice. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the second. These are the two that you have the options for in the discussion post. And we have 4, see if I can get them to come up here. There we go. Current serving Supreme Court justices. So 4 out of 9, like that's a pretty good percentage. However, right, that's not necessarily a reflection of all of the judiciary. And then just a little context here. So far total in the history of the Supreme Court, we've had 116 justices overall. 6 have been female. So that's like 4 or 5% of them, which is not the best. But we're moving in a positive direction, right? And you'll hear more about that in whichever choice you make for the discussion post. All right. So one of the reasons that people will give for underrepresentation in criminal law, like we talked about, is because of the adversarial system. And I have mixed feelings about this argument, but we're going to talk it through. This adversarial system that we use, right? You have the prosecution, you have the defense, and then they go at it, and then the winner wins. Even when you do a plea bargain, like there's a clear winner, typically. And It's kind of rooted in patriarchy, which we talked about at the beginning, which is a very kind of hierarchical binary system. There's a lot of opposition, there's a lot of conflict, and there can be a lot of aggression. While females can do all of these things, right? Women can do all of these things. We're not socialized to prioritize that type of thinking. And so it's thought to be kind of a turnoff for females. And then you couple that with like the scheduling issues and the on call all the time. And that's one of kind of the exit paths that we see for females. So like, I don't really want to get into all that. I just want to like do this work in a different way. Like I said, I have mixed feelings about this argument, and I think that as society is maybe gaining a little bit more gender inequality, I don't know, kind of see that this argument might die down and that you might see more females entering criminal law. I got to tell you, just by virtue of existing in a faculty position at YSU and talking to students, I would say, it's my made up number here, but I would say roughly 80% of the students that end up in my classes that are going to law school are female. Now, a lot of them are going to end up in this class, right? Which is an elective that has to do with gender. So they're going to probably self-select in here a little bit more often. But I think that trend might be changing. Just, it's my anecdotal evidence. Let's take that for what it's worth. All right. One of the common arguments you see against female judges, and in places where judges are elected, like placed on a ballot and elected, you'll see, their adversary who they're running against kind of post a lot of ads that deal with, oh, they're just so soft on crime. They just want to give everybody hugs, right? It's that kind of undertone. It's that kind of like vibe that's being sent out because there's this perception that female judges are softer on crime, right? That they just don't have the backbone to punish somebody, or they're too empathetic to punish an offender. That's kind of the thought process for a lot of people. And so a lot of people are kind of reluctant to accept female judges or vote for female judges or nominate female judges or things like that. But when you look at the evidence, female judges are actually just a smidge harsher than male judges typically. Some people say it's because most of the offenders that they're dealing with are male, right? So it's easier for them to sentence males harsher. I never really understood this argument than it would be for females because they're less likely to identify with that male offender, whereas a male judge would identify with a male offender a little bit more. Who knows? The other theory for this is because they're actively fighting against that stereotype that females are softer on crime, right? They're saying, oh, well, if I have the choice of giving you, I'm just going to make this up, 5 years versus 8 years. If I give you 5, people might think I'm a big softie, so I better give you 8 to like maintain my rep. Who knows which one's right? It's probably a combination of those two and many other things. However, we do see that female judges typically sentence longer than male judges. So, fun fact. All right. Like I said, this was a very, very brief toe in the water type of situation when it comes to females in the law. So we'll stop here, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.